Before the session begins, support the video with a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from.
I remember that morning as clearly as I remember the boy's face when he walked into my courtroom like he already owned a piece of it. City Hall was waking up slow that day. Out in the corridor you could hear that low murmur of voices, shoes on old stone, somebody laughing too loud, then catching themselves when they saw the security officers. The rain had just let up. People brought it in on their coats and shoes, so the place smelled faintly of wet wool and pavement. From the back row I heard the soft clicks of a camera, some local reporter grabbing a few shots. Nothing unusual. On paper it was just another morning. I was looking over the docket when one file caught my eye. The folder was thin, the paperwork immaculate, every line typed, every box checked. It looked less like a traffic case and more like something prepared for a law school exam. Too clean, I remember thinking. Somebody cared a little too much about a small ticket. That's when he came in. He was maybe 25, 27 at most. Good-looking kid, sharp jaw, perfectly cut hair. The suit was expensive. You could tell even from the bench, dark, fitted, the kind you don't buy off the rack. But he didn't sit like a man in trouble. He leaned back, one arm draped over the back of the bench, ankle resting on his knee, the way people sit in their own living room. Next to him was his mother. Neat blouse, simple jewelry, the kind of woman you can see has spent a lot of years taking care of everyone but herself. She sat straight, hands folded over her purse, eyes moving from me to her son and back again. He turned to her and said, just loud enough for the first row to hear, including me, "Mom, relax. We don't lose cases." There was a little curl at the edge of his mouth when he said it, not a warm smile, a knowing one, the kind of smile people wear when they believe the rules are for somebody else. In his right hand he had a set of BMW keys, and he kept tapping them on the table. Not the nervous, quick tapping I've seen thousands of times, but slow, deliberate metal on wood, like a tiny metronome, marking his confidence. When my clerk called his name, he didn't stand right away. He let a couple of seconds pass, still looking straight ahead, as if to remind the room that the schedule could bend around him. Then he rose, smoothed his tie, and walked to the podium with that same easy stride. As he stopped, he reached to adjust his cuff. It was a small movement, something most people wouldn't notice, but from where I sat, I saw the slightest tremor in his fingers. Not much, just enough to tell me that under all that polish there was a little earthquake running through him. I've been on the bench a long time. I've seen loud men who were solid as granite and quiet ones who fell apart at the first question. Looking at him, hearing those keys against the wood, seeing that tiny shake in his hand, I remember thinking, this kid makes a lot of noise, but he's not nearly as sure of himself as he wants the world to believe. I looked down at the file and wondered how a case like this had made its way onto my docket in the first place. Parking violations and handicap zones are usually handled quickly by another judge. They don't travel far unless there's something unusual about them. And this one, well, it had a few splinters sticking out of it. The charge was simple on its face. His BMW had been left in a handicap spot for nearly an hour, not 5 minutes, not 10:53. Long enough that a woman in a wheelchair had to be dropped off in the middle of the street because she couldn't reach the ramp. I'd seen thousands of tickets, but these were the ones that always hit a nerve. My father used to say, "Son, you can tell a lot about a person by how they treat those who can't fight back." Those words echoed in me every time a case like this came around. As I read deeper, the pattern began to unfold. This wasn't his first time. 3 prior warnings, same attitude, same disregard, same eventual disappearance of the fines. Each time, the signature at the bottom of the appeal was his father's, a well-known attorney in the city, smart, relentless, and very good at making small problems evaporate before they touched his son. Still, something about this file didn't sit right. Cases like these don't usually jump tracks, yet this one had been reassigned, routed up the chain, and placed neatly on my desk. No note, no explanation. It was the kind of administrative decision that whispers rather than announces itself. I remember thinking, someone wants this handled carefully or quietly. When I asked the young man to confirm his name and address, the change in him was immediate. Earlier he lounged. Now he stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back like he was posing for a brochure on courtroom etiquette. "Yes, Your Honor." "No, Your Honor." The cadence was too polished, the manners too practiced. I've heard genuine respect, and I've heard rehearsed deference. He spoke like someone who'd been coached not for truth, but for image. His mother watched him with an expression I knew well, pride mixed with something heavier, something she hoped no one else could read. But from the bench, you see everything the way her thumb traced circles on her purse strap, the tightness around her mouth whenever he paused too long. He, meanwhile, kept scanning the room. Not with fear, fear looks inward. He was looking outward, taking stock of who might recognize him, who might be judging him, who might report back to his father. That constant flick of the eyes told me more than his words did, and in that moment I understood. He wasn't worried about the law. He was worried about disappointing the man who had always cleaned up after him. It was the first real glimpse of the boy behind the suit. I asked him to explain, in his own words, why the car had been there so long. He lifted his chin, steadied his voice, and said, "I was only there for a minute, Your Honor. I just ran inside to grab some paperwork." A familiar line. Too familiar. I opened the folder, slid out the photographs the officer had taken, each stamped with its own quiet truth. 53 minutes. Same angle, same car, same blue paint stretching beneath it like a warning he pretended he never saw. The room shifted. People leaned in, not loudly, just with that subtle tension that tells you the air has changed. I placed the photos on the bench. I didn't say a word. Silence is sometimes the fairest cross-examination. He glanced at them, and that easy confidence he carried earlier lost a little of its shine. His right hand disappeared into his pocket, his fingers pressing against the fabric, a protective gesture. A young man suddenly aware he no longer controlled the room. When I asked about the prior warnings, something flickered across his face. Not guilt, anticipation. He looked toward his mother, a single quick movement of the eyes, as if she might supply the script he'd misplaced. "I didn't see the handicap sign," he added quickly. His voice betrayed him, not cracking, not shaking, but tightening. People lie in different ways. Some lie loudly, some lie softly. His lie came wrapped in over-precision, but barely a minute later, trying to reinforce his story, he said, "All the other spots were taken, so I—" The sentence hung there like a rope he'd tossed and accidentally stepped into himself. "You can't miss a sign you also claim you were avoiding." A quiet sigh rose from somewhere in the second row. Not dramatic, just the kind of weary exhale older folks make when they recognize a pattern they've seen too many times. The officer who wrote the ticket lifted his hand, calm, respectful. "Your Honor." The signs posted on the pole and painted bright blue on the pavement. It was fully visible. He spoke with no edge, no triumph, just steady truth. And steady truth can sound louder than any accusation. The young man blinked, once, slowly. Then he swallowed. His jaw moved as though he were weighing two different versions of himself, the one he presented, and the one these facts were dragging into daylight. "Maybe," he said, voice dropping half a step. "Maybe I wasn't paying enough attention." That small admission, soft as it was, broke more tension in the room than any outburst could have. It was the first honest sound he'd made that morning. His mother lowered her gaze, not in defeat, more in recognition, as if she finally saw that this wasn't a case her husband could sweep aside, and that the truth was beginning to settle, uninvited, between her and her son. A few people in the gallery gave the slightest nods, not smug, not pleased, just confirming what their instincts had already told them. Moments like that remind me how observant ordinary people can be. They read character the way some folks read weather. From the bench, I watched the boy's shoulders shift. Not slump, not collapse, just shift. A fractional drop, but enough to show that the armor he'd walked in wearing had developed its first crack. And in that very small quiet I found myself thinking, this isn't just a ticket anymore. This is the moment a young man realizes the world won't always bend to his confidence. I asked him one more routine question, nothing sharp, nothing meant to corner him, and that was the moment everything slid off the rails. He drew a breath, squared his shoulders, and said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a simple parking ticket. We're wasting time here." It wasn't what he said, it was how. The tone carried a slick confidence that didn't belong in a courtroom, not in front of the people who had taken time off work, not in front of the woman whose day he'd upended. His words didn't challenge the charge, they challenged the room. And for the first time that morning, I saw several faces shift, brows tighten. Pride can be loud, but disrespect, that's what stirs a crowd. His mother touched his sleeve, a gentle, urgent signal to stop. He pulled his arm away without looking at her. The officer who wrote the ticket leaned back slightly, not out of fear, just in the way people do when they're surprised a flame suddenly jumps. The courtroom, usually filled with quiet coughing and shuffling feet, fell into a stillness that felt heavier than sound. It was the silence of people holding their breath, waiting to see what kind of man the boy really was when his mask slipped. Inside, I felt a heat rise in my chest, not anger, exactly disappointment. It brought back something my father used to say. A man's dignity shows when he's asked to listen. And this young man had never learned how to listen. Not to his mother, not to the officer, not to the voice inside him that should have warned him he'd crossed a line. I knew I couldn't let that moment pass, not because of the court, not because of the law, but because if no one stopped him here, someday the consequences would grow teeth. Before I could respond, a hand rose from the gallery. A quiet, steady hand. It was the woman in the wheelchair, the same woman forced into the street because his car blocked the only accessible space. She hadn't been called as a witness. She was here for an entirely different matter, waiting for her case, sitting unnoticed until she heard his name. I nodded to her. Her voice was soft, but it traveled through the room as if carried on a wire. I remember that day. I had to wait in the street. Cars were honking. It was embarrassing. No accusation, no fury, just the truth delivered with such simplicity that it cut through every defense he'd tried to build. The effect on him was immediate and unmistakable. Color rushed into his cheeks. He dropped his gaze to the table. It wasn't the defiant downward glance of a man rejecting judgment. It was the look of someone suddenly seeing himself from the outside and not liking what he saw. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words fragmented before they formed. I didn't know. He stopped there. The rest wouldn't come. His mother closed her eyes, and there was something in that gesture that struck me harder than his outburst. Not just sorrow, recognition. She had seen this moment coming long before he did. And I remember thinking, as the room settled into a different kind of silence, this was never about a parking space. It was about a young man finally meeting the truth face to face, with no one left to shield him. I asked the officer if there were any additional photographs. He stepped forward and handed me a second set angles that hadn't been in the original stack. I laid them out one by one. In the first photo, 2 open parking spaces sat just a few cars away, clear as daylight. In the second, the young man's BMW was positioned squarely across the blue markings, only steps from the entrance. Not convenience by accident, convenience by choice. I felt something settle inside me. This wasn't a moment of confusion, I thought. This was a decision. The boy looked at the images as though each one dimmed the room a little more. When he finally spoke, the bravado was gone. I was late for work, he murmured. I didn't think. The words drifted off, unfinished. But for the first time, they were real. Not polished, not rehearsed, raw, small, human. His voice carried the sound of someone recognizing he couldn't charm or argue his way out of what the evidence showed. From the gallery, the woman in the wheelchair raised her hand again, hesitated, then lowered it slightly when she saw I'd noticed her. Thank you, Your Honor, for letting me speak earlier. Her gratitude wasn't aimed at punishment. It was directed at being seen, and it shifted the entire tone of the courtroom. The tension softened. The room breathed again. Justice in that moment didn't feel like a hammer, it felt like acknowledgement. I looked at the young man. His shoulders had lost their stiffness, replaced by something closer to humility. His mother, who had been frozen in quiet dread, leaned forward. He's not a bad kid, she said softly. His father always fixed things for him. Maybe too much. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no excuses, just a mother admitting a truth she'd held for years. And behind that admission I saw the real story, not entitlement, but a boy raised under the shelter of someone else's influence, never allowed to face the natural weight of his choices. I took a moment, let the silence settle. There are times when a courtroom needs stillness more than speech. Then I announced my decision. The fine stands as written, I said. And in addition, you will complete volunteer hours with the community program supporting individuals with disabilities. Attendance is not optional. He didn't argue. He didn't sigh. He simply nodded, small, deliberate, almost relieved. It was the first moment he accepted something without negotiation. His mother placed a hand on the back of his arm. This time, he didn't pull away. And I remember thinking, The real impact of justice isn't in the penalty, it's in the moment a person finally sees the human being on the other side of their actions. When the hearing ended, he didn't rush for the door the way many young defendants do. He walked slowly to the woman in the wheelchair. He stopped beside her, lowered his head, and said quietly, "I'm sorry." No theatrics, no attempt to be overheard, just a simple apology from a young man who finally understood the weight of a moment he once dismissed. His mother stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder, not gripping, not guiding. Proud, in a small, cautious way. The kind of pride that comes when someone you love finally turns toward the harder path. Around the room, people gave small nods, faint smiles. No triumph, no bitterness. It was one of those rare courtroom moments where everyone felt something had landed in the right place. Months passed. His volunteer assignment was completed without extensions or excuses. The coordinator of the disability support program sent me a short note. He showed up on time. He asked questions. He helped. Just those 3 simple sentences, but they carried more meaning than a stack of legal documents. Some weeks later, another envelope arrived. The handwriting was his. Inside was a single line. "Thank you for not treating this like just a parking ticket." To this Isai, no signature from his father, no letterhead from a law office, just a young man standing on his own words for the first time, and life, as it often does, brought a quiet echo. A few months afterward, the woman in the wheelchair appeared again in my courtroom on a different matter. When her case concluded, she paused before leaving and said, almost in a whisper, "You handled that boy right, Judge." Her smile was small, but genuine, an acknowledgement I've carried with me ever since. I've seen thousands of cases, but some stay with you not because of the law, but because of the humanity threaded through them. This one stayed because it reminded me what justice can be when it's not about punishment, but understanding. And the truth I've learned through all these years is simple. A person grows the moment they truly see the impact of their choices.